I want to welcome everyone to the fourth module of teaching Transmedia Typography of the Design Educators Typography Intensive. This continues the tradition and legacy of Art Center Professor Leah Hoffmitz Milken, who for 3 decades was a dedicated instructor and dedicated to giving back to her students and her fellow educators. She was intensely interested in the effects of technology and changing cultural influences on the design of letter forms, typography, and the role that it played in visual communication. Before we start, before I introduce my wonderful panelists, I have to thank Google, our partner. And if it wasn't for Google, I'm not even sure we'd all be here. So thank you, Google, very much. It's great that you see the importance of supporting typography. And with that said, after Brad and Roy do their presentations, I want to remind everyone that we do have a classroom that follows. So without further ado, 2 of my favorite people, Brad Bartlett is a designer. Wave Brad so they know, oh, your name is on there. Is a designer, educator, and author. He's been faculty at Art Center College of Design, and I can't believe this, since 1999. You were awarded the Great Teacher Award in 2003 and again in 2014. He is the faculty director of Transmedia in the graphic design department. And this is where he developed the pedagogy and has overseen the curricular implementation. New to being an instructor at Art Center College of Design, he teaches generative typography at Art Center, which has become an integral part of transmedia design as the program grows, is Roy Tatum, who's a Los Angeles-based multidisciplinary designer. And he's currently a partner at Quarter. It's a studio based both in Los Angeles and in New York. Roy also co-founded and serves as creative director at Numbers, a design studio specializing in type and identity design. So I get to say goodbye. Brad, you may start sharing the screen at any moment. And
okay,
I believe you're doing in tandem. So I'll wait until you feel very secure that your screen is shared. And I'll pop back when you're all finished.
Okay, great. Sounds good, Gloria. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, everyone see this okay?
Yes,
good?
So far so good.
Okay. Well, what we want to start off with, you guys, is just a quick video that compiles a lot of the really interesting projects from our classroom. And that video begins to kind of set the stage and create an atmosphere for today's presentation and discussion. So without further ado, I'll play that video. Okay, guys. Well, we just want to share that video with you as a way to, kind of begin to talk about the work in a very visual way. What I'd like to talk about next, just briefly, is what transmedia is. And so transmedia is simply design across media. So we look at the idea of creating dynamic graphic and typographic systems across print, screen, and spatial media. And we like for students to develop seamless graphic languages that traverse all those three media in a way that's compelling, and also in a way that is embracing emerging tools and technologies. So you'll see that within this diagram, this T-shaped diagram, you'll see that the horizontal bar talks about cross-media synergy across print, screen, and spatial media. And then you'll see that the vertical stem of the T begins to talk about some of the emerging tools and technologies that support the creation of dynamic identities that exist across all these different media types.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's cool here is, so these on that STEM, generative design, media, texture, those are classes within the curriculum, within the transmedia curriculum at Art Center. And the cool thing about the way the program has been set up by Brad is that students have the opportunity for, exploring print, screen, and spatial media within the context of the transmedia typography class that he teaches, but also allows those projects to go into other classes like generative design and media texture, where students are able to really explore the tools and technologies in a very applied way, having brought the content from the transmedia typography class into the context of those classes. So for example, in my generative typography class, it gives students a better understanding of the tools and techniques in a very applied way that allows them to learn and experiment at the same time. So it's a really great way to do a lot of really hands-on folk learning with the goal of being able to take what they're learning in generative design and media texture and apply it into the type 5 class, but also whatever classes they end up taking in the future.
Cool. So for today's presentation, we're going to break this up into 5 different kind of segments. The first is going to be a series of case studies that take you into our classroom and show you some of the projects that we feel like embody core values that are important to making transmedia typography and generative typography. Following that, we're going to take a look at what's involved in designing a class. And Roy's going to kind of take you through the process, his design process of creating curriculum and pedagogy for generative typography. Following that, we're going to take a look at the process that a student goes through over the course of 14 weeks in our transmedia typography class, and that'll be a primarily visual kind of essay, kind of a visual journey through that class. Our fourth segment is going to talk about how we've shifted and pivoted, in relation to the COVID-19 crisis that we're all kind of working through right now, how we've migrated to online learning methodologies and how we found value and opportunities in working in that space. The last segment of our presentation is going to take a look at how some of the experiments that we conduct in the classroom environment end up living in a professional setting. And we'll take a look at the view book that we created for Art Center and how that embodies a lot of the code-based tools, a lot of the processes and methods that we've developed in the classroom. So the first project we'd like to talk about is the Afropunk Festival. And this is a project that was designed by Yuma Nato. And Afropunk is a festival that really celebrates the idea of inclusion, music, creativity, freedom, and it has such a great message of positivity. And we felt like in curating the work to show you guys today, it was important to shine a light on projects that have that kind of have that sensitivity to what's happening in the world as a set of its core values. And so for this project, some of the things we want to talk about in addition to a sensitivity to what's happening in the world is the idea of how to build typographic systems that traverse print, screen, spatial, and then ultimately emerging media. So Yuma designed a modular logotype and typeface. And in doing so, that helps to carry a lot of the weight of the messaging and also helps to reinforce the brand identity. You know, it can be pattern, it can be logo type, it can provide typographic, typographic structure. It has great flexibility. And again, it's the very DNA of the way that he approached this project. Messaging was really important for Yuma too. And again, underscoring this message of positivity, of inclusion, of unity, all those things were very important as he gave shape to this project. This is his poster series here. And in the classroom, we like to start with print-based media, and we like to move from print-based media into screen-based media, and then ultimately into spatial and emerging media. What we like to do in the classroom is help a student work from something that they might know already in terms of traditional media over to something that they are still learning to work with in the realm of emerging media. Here we have an example of his website. And I just love the detail he added to the cursor. Here we have a series of posters for this particular year's theme, which is Afrotopia. And here you can see how the logo type then becomes pattern in the background, almost like an ambient typographic gesture that helps to reinforce the brand identity. This is his microsite. Translation to app and digital ticketing. And then we have several frames that begin to talk about the story of how someone would encounter the festival in a spatial context, a kind of journey, a journey from the outside to the very stage with which the performances are taking place. Next, I want to show you a project that he created using emerging tools and technologies in a class that we have called Media Texture. And Media Texture is taught by Miles Mazzi and Ivan Cruz. And in Media Texture, what we do is we challenge graphic design students to work in a spatial context with new tools and technologies. And with Yuma, what he wanted to do was he wanted to create an experience that used the body as a means to create interaction. So how can we dance with typography? Next project I want to show you guys is a project that's really also very, very timely. And it's a visual identity for Wikipedia. And this particular student, Sharon Park, was really interested in examining ideas of diversity and accessibility in the production of shared knowledge. So how can we design systems? How can we create messaging? How can we organize communities to counter bias in systems that create, collect, and share knowledge? I just love these posters here. These posters are also posters that provide really, kind of startling statistics. Who writes for Wikipedia? Well, it's 90% male. What culture is the culture that's writing most of the content for Wikipedia? Only 20% of the world, primarily Western, is writing 80% of the content.
I was just gonna say, these posters are like a really great example too of how the projects in the Transmedia typography class allow students to research and learn more about subject matter that they're interested in. So here, Sharon's working on a project for Wikipedia, exploring it across all these different media types, but also, she's generating a lot of the content that you see here too. So the posters like this didn't exist. It was something that she was interested in, did research into, and was able to pull together in order to have the content to provide for these posters. So I think like that's also something that I've witnessed from students in these classes that I think is pretty unique.
Yeah, I love the idea. I mean, in many ways, the search itself is part of the process, and the process of discovery that students make along the way, in many ways, is perhaps more valuable than the end result. And these posters illustrate the poetry of search. I feel like these are data poems or data haikus. So you might move from something like Tupac Shakur all the way down to Pope John Paul, the 23rd, which I just think is so interesting, the process of search, kind of that serendipitous discovery that you make along the way. She was particularly interested in the design of the website and to make the design of the website accessible, to make it friendly to different linguistic communities. And also what was really important for her was to design a content management system, an input system that would reduce the amount of friction an editor would have in inputting and editing content.
So it's kind of interesting too to think about like the process of editing Wikipedia right now. And I think Sharon was interested in kind of making it more accessible and exploring things like real-time editing that might make it easier for someone to edit, that might not have kind of the technical understanding of things like Markdown or other ways that editing was existing currently. And I think for an organization like Wikipedia, that experience is pretty important. So I think it's kind of cool to see her exploring that within the context of the web design that she was doing and kind of acknowledging that over the course of these screens.
This message of linguistic inclusion is also something that, that comes to life in the ID collateral, letterhead, business card envelope. Next, she designed a conference called Wiki Room. And that conference was something very specific to, ideas of inclusion, diversity, who is creating this knowledge which becomes systemic and is shared with everyone. And how can we begin to have a dialogue around those systems and those processes? Here she writes, systemic barriers prevent women and entire cultures from being present online. Technological barriers make it impossible for millions to enter the conversation. Next, she took some of her ideas into a virtual reality space. So a few of the questions that we like to ask in moving towards this phase of the project are, how does typography function in virtual reality? How can type be more than just furniture? This is a quick sketch that she made that was then brought into some specialized software, which I believe was provided by Google. Roy, can you talk about this?
Yeah, it's like basically using Google Cardboard and like a 360-degree image viewer. And I think like tools like this and putting together a VR prototype in this way is a really nice way for students to explore the medium of VR without some of the technical constraints that they might run into in terms of like learning code related to it or having to have like a specialized computer for it. So this kind of like lo-fi way of working with it in a very like prototype, but also very, high resolution way from a design perspective, I think is really great.
It leads to some really interesting questions. What happens in a virtual space when almost any surface can be an interface? Could the spines of the book on that bookshelf be a means to change from different language systems, from English to German to Spanish to French? And how do we work with typography, in Z space with a kind of Z axis, And ultimately, how do we make information playful and fun and accessible? So Sharon also put together a process video that documents the way that she prototyped her VR project in one of our classroom spaces. The project was a lot of fun. Next, I want to talk about a project designed by a student. His name is Zeke Waddles, and it's an identity for Dub Lab. And Dub Lab is a radio station that cultivates music and art and culture, and it's very grassroots. So how can we mix analog and digital media? How can we build our own tools to create unique experiences? And I'll let Roy talk a little bit more deeply about Dub Lab and their ethos.
Yeah, so Dub Lab is an online radio station that's been around since 1999. And they've kind of broadcast music from all over the world. Their programming is pretty eclectic. They also have like a big community aspect to them. So they put on like art exhibits, film screenings, different record release events, and educational programs. So they're all about like community building. There's a very nice like DIY and independent kind of vibe as well. So I think in a lot of the work that we're going to look at in Zeke's project, it also has that same DIY ethos present.
This is an example of hacking into a tool called processing, or a coding language called processing, and a tool like a Connect sensor. And what Zeke is proposing here is the idea of drawing with sound. And his visual reference is an oscilloscope. And you can see how the oscilloscope then begins to inform, some of the graphic elements that inhabit his posters. And that same concept and idea was also a key component to the design of his logotype. And what Zeke did is he didn't just stop at the logotype. Zeke designed a whole entire typeface based upon the same ideas and principles. This shows it executed in a poster. And then he worked on a second typeface, which was based on Data 70. He's calling this Data 80. And it's a modular typeface, and modularity gives us great flexibility and lends itself to code-based environments in a really, really interesting way.
Yeah, I think a lot of the exploration that the students in the Transmedia typography class are doing with modular typefaces really lend themselves well to being explored further in classes like media texture and generative typography. This specific way of working with type and approaching type kind of through the lens of graphic design really lends it well to being accomplished in a relatively short amount of time by the students. And then when we start to bring it into code, those modules and units that are comprising, all of that typography, they kind of translate one-to-one into the work that we're doing in processing. So from a code perspective, there's kind of like this interesting back and forth from like a systems perspective.
Here we see an example of Zeke working with a Kinect sensor, literally hacking a Kinect sensor. He's also working, as Roy mentioned, with a coding language called processing. And then with his phone, he's working with another app. It's called Touch OSC. So it's really a mashup of all these different digital technologies, a kind of ecosystem, a hacker ecosystem that he's using to create his own tools, which then create unique experiences and unique form languages. So of course we work across print and screen. And I really like this print booklet as well. In conversation with DubLab, Zeke was able to kind of connect with the founder, and he discovered they had all these amazing podcasts. And what Zeke wanted to do was translate those podcasts, really transmediate those podcasts into these small booklets, these small self-contained booklets. So again, how can we create custom tools for users to participate in the act of design? Zeke designed this interface, which enabled users to design their own posters and to adjust the variables with which the type would exist in those posters. He then connected that poster generator to a dot matrix printer and to create a kind of a really interesting mashup of new technology using code-based operations and older technologies, output devices like the dot matrix printer.
Yeah, one thing we talk a lot about too in the class is how the choice of tool that the student makes kind of leaves an impact on the work. So we talk a lot about how, picking the right tool for the type of project you want to work on, but also, like Brad mentioned, encouraging them to make their own tools. And I think like this feels like the kind of DIY approach that students take and kind of really rolling up their sleeves and learning through making and really experimenting with these new tools and technologies is really cool to see. And I think like it's, again, this is always happening like in a relatively short amount of time. So it's cool to see how much they're able to achieve and learn within the course of these classes.
Zeke was able to continue his project and to take it one step further. So, it's really interesting when projects, as Roy mentioned, that are developed in a very tight time scale in the classroom are then let loose out in the wild. And Zeke had an opportunity to create an ASCII photo booth for the 20th anniversary of DubLab. And these are some clips of that experience. So a really fun project, very, very DIY, and kind of the approach that Zeke adopted in giving shape to the identity and all the transmedia elements are in many ways reflective of the core values of the organization. The next project I want to talk about is from a student. His name is Chris Taylor, and it was a visual identity for Transmedia in Berlin. And so how can we program typography using artificial intelligence? How can we use algorithms as a tool in the creative process itself? So these are some of the typographic compositions that Chris generated, using AI as a co-creator in the design process. This illustrates the flexibility of that typographic language in a web-based environment. Next, we see it translated to screen, or to print rather. Then to app, a digital ticket as well. And then Chris was really interested in virtual reality as well. So he wanted to take some of those typographic compositions into an immersive virtual space. So how do we prototype immersive media? You know, and also how do we document and share our discoveries when we work in that media type? So here we're just sharing some quick process videos of the documentation process that you see was in our large classroom on South Campus, down below the Type Center. We love that we're sharing space with the Type Center and with Gloria. And so this is in the historic wind tunnel building of South Campus. And we know that documentation is an important way to tell the story of these projects. And so we spend a lot of time prototyping, fabricating, documenting, editing, and ultimately pulling together these process videos. Next project we want to share is from a very special student, and this student was the first TA in the generative type class that Roy created, and his name is Taka Iwai, and he chose the I/O Festival, and that festival explores art, code, and also the ethics of emerging technology. So how can we sketch with code-based tools? How can we co-create a design experience?
These sketches are you know, Taka working simultaneously in, you know, the Adobe Creative Suite, but also exploring tools like processing for sketching his logo type. So, you know, from week to week, one thing that we've tried to do with the generative typography class and the syllabus in that class is to try to align it to some of the work that's happening in classes like media texture and type 5 transmedia, so that students have the opportunity to kind of work back and forth between all of these classes. So at the same time that students are designing logo types in Brad's type 5 class, they can start to explore those same logo types from a code perspective in the generative typography class. And that back and forth has been leading to some interesting results for students, and also gives them, like I mentioned earlier, a very applied way to learn code.
What was really nice about Taka's project is that some of the discoveries he made sketching and processing and using code-based operations then informed the way that he decided he wanted to work with a poster. And so instead of having a printed poster, Taka proposed a projected poster that would react and change according to people passing by. We thought that was really inventive. And he also thought it would be interesting to kind of play with the idea of materiality in more traditional media like envelopes. So there you see an example of how he approached that on the left-hand panel. These are some other logo types that he worked on. And again, these logo types are dynamic, they're responsive, they really do require input from the user to come to life. This is his final logo. And quite literally the I in I/O is following the cursor as it moves across the screen. And he retains that gesture of playfulness in the design of the homepage for the conference. And part of the conference was really focused on the idea of machine learning and artificial intelligence, you know, the kind of the creativity that affords us, but also some of the ethical underpinnings of working with those new technologies and those new tools.
Yeah, I think this project is another great example of how students in these classes can pursue projects that allow them the opportunity to research things that they're interested in. So for example, you know, here we're looking at like a kind of typical data set that's used to train generative adversarial networks, or GANs. And I think like Taka is interested in kind of discussing both the kind of like ethical implications of those data sets, but also interested in exploring them from a technical perspective. So here he has the chance to do both within the space of this project.
Next, Taka brought some of these ideas into a class called media texture. And again, this underscores some of the pedagogical cross-pollination that we like to encourage across the transmedia classes. So how can we collaborate with AI? You know, how can we train machines to see? You know, what are the implications, challenges, and opportunities in working in this space? This is a process video that shows Taka's project. And what I believe as an educator that's so important is the idea of leveraging the collective mind of the classroom. And that collective mind, when brought together in a really powerful way, is so much more valuable to the experience than just one person, you know, kind of in a teaching position, dictating to students. So my thing here when I look at this work is he's taken the collective mind of the classroom and he's literally blended all the students together into one continuous kind of deep fake, really, is what he's working with here.
The typography is also trained using that same GAN. So it's interesting, you know, what we're seeing here is called a latent spacewalk, and it's basically an animation that goes through all the different permutations of outputs that you can get from that GAN that he's trained with a data set of all of the fonts that he has loaded on his computer. So kind of cool to see how the typography itself is also, you know, using a GAN in the same way that the images are in this installation.
So again, the idea that AI is going to replace designers is maybe one thought, but you know, the idea that AI is maybe a co-collaborator in the design process is perhaps a thought that we would like to embrace and work with as designers moving into the future. Okay, next, I'm just so excited to have Roy talk about a class that he designed called Generative Typography. And we've seen elements of how generative typography fit within and complement these larger identity systems. What Roy's going to do here is take a moment to talk about what's involved in designing a class, and he'll take you through some of the projects within generative typography that underscore how valuable code-based tools can be to a graphic designer. So again, this is our T-shaped diagram. And what you see highlighted right here is this idea of generative typography and how those emerging tools and technologies really do enhance and support seamless storytelling across media.
So like I mentioned, or like Brad mentioned, Taka was the first TA for the generative typography class. And I think when I first started working on the class, me and him were talking a lot. I have also gone through the program. I was actually in the second transmedia typography class that Brad taught about 10 years ago. And having just gone through those classes, I think we had an interesting conversation about how to best structure a class like this specifically for graphic design students. So one of the first things that I started doing was mapping out like how generative design classes are typically taught from like a code perspective. So on the left, you have on the far left column is maybe a more computer science program, and then on the far right, a more graphic design focused program. And you could kind of see like how these different concepts are introduced in different ways at different times in the term. And one thing I was really interested in is I think, you know, in seeing this, I kind of had the realization that oftentimes we think about graphic designers perhaps not being good with code, or like we have to teach it in a kind of limited way because they're graphic designers. But what we've been experimenting with is actually introducing the more difficult stuff earlier on so that they have more time to get comfortable with it. And the way that we kind of help them get comfortable with it is by changing their perspective of what code is. So I really love this quote from Donald Knuth that's from the Metafont book that says, "Meta design is much more difficult than design. It's easier to draw something than to explain how to draw it." So the first class, we start off with doing a quick exercise that's based on this sort of as a provocation, where each student takes turns writing instructions for another student on how to draw on the whiteboard. And they quickly realize that it is very difficult to describe how to draw something, but this process that they're going through and trying to write a description of how to draw a letter on a whiteboard is the exact process they're going to go through once they start working with code. And really what this exercise does is kind of change how they think about and talk about code. And so what I like to tell the students when we start the class is, you know, my background's not in computer science. I'm a graphic designer. So I understand where they're coming from, but really what we focus on is communication and abstraction. So we want to avoid the stigma that coding is all about how good at math you are. Really, coding is just a form of communication. You're learning a language. And so that's kind of how we talk about it. And so just to remove that stigma, we don't focus on code for the first 2 weeks. You know, we focus on going through the kind of like a generative type project in its totality, from concept and research to then sketching and design. And then we work with code in a kind of limited way where we're just working with storyboards and abstraction. So we have an idea and then we extract it into a set of storyboard and basically create a set of rules or instructions that we will then translate into code. So here we've seen an example of Jennifer Bong's work. This next project from Hina Chung is kind of similar, but this is what, you know, showing what we do in the first 2 weeks of the class. So here Hina is exploring decay and kind of focusing on digital decay. So this shows some of the research she's been doing into, you know, things like bit flipping, glitch, data moshing, and she's then working through that from a photographic perspective, and then seeing how to apply some of those ideas to code and typography. So we start, like Brad mentioned, with designing kind of these modular geometric typefaces. So here she's designed a typeface based on a square that she kind of liked the relationship between binary and bits and that square form. And then using code, she's able to then start to explore decay by either removing bits. So on the left, you see the kind of binary data that's generating those letter forms on the right. She's also exploring things like bit flipping and glitching. And so these are different parameters that we'll then bring into code and start to build a parametric type system around. And here you can see the instructions that she's kind of starting to work with in order to get prepared to actually write the code. I think that's one thing we're focusing a lot on as well, making sure that, I think, you know, you don't want to feel the kind of like paralysis of sitting in front of the blank code editor and not knowing where to start. So we always sketch and write everything. And then thinking about how to structure the classes. So one thing that I was thinking a lot about is, can the structure of the class itself feel programmed? And so to that end, the class is kind of broken down into 3 parts. We have, so every class is broken into these 3 parts: demo, discuss, and debug. So for demo, each class begins with a code-based exercise or series of exercises that build in complexity over the term, both from a design perspective, but also from a code perspective. And so some of those demos, so, you know, we work in processing. So we start off the term working with letter form design, bringing individual characters and modules in from Illustrator, learning how to recreate those designs in processing. We then start to explore how to add and manipulate different parameters. And we explore how to then also compose different kinds of typography with that. We then translate those letter forms into typefaces using tools like font self or glyphs. And then we start to explore other things we can do with them. So all these examples here are looking at how to access the kind of contour of the letter forms and how we can start to create dynamic drawings based on those contours. And then ultimately we end up at the end of the term thinking about text and generative design from a more broad perspective. So we explore some data visualization and text analysis. We work with larger bodies of text in hopes of expanding the kind of definition of generative typography for the students, so that they can bring this type of work not only into the identity-driven projects like Brad has been showing, but also perhaps book projects or more poster-driven projects later on in their art center. And then the second component of the class is discuss. So every week we have readings and lectures that contextualize the code that we show in the demos. I think up till this point in a student's career at Art Center, they have a lot of good references for graphic design projects. And one thing that I'm really focused on in the class is how to connect all of that sort of like mental archive that they have while to some of the work that we're doing in this class. So they kind of get the ideas, you know, contextualize a little bit more than you typically would in a coding class. I like to show examples like things like Donald Knuth's Metafont, or even examples on the far left, the Fregio Meccano, which is made from a modular system made from, you know, wood typography. I think, like, to me, showing the students the kind of like historical precedent for the types of things we're exploring helps give them a more broad reference point that isn't so focused on the future.
That's excellent.
And then the last part of the class is debug. So this is studio time where we discuss challenges and review weekly exercises. So I want to share some work in progress stuff from this term. So this is Hina's project again. This is about after 6 weeks of working with code and typography and code. So you can see we're working with some kind of like parametric type systems, but trying to push at what that really means, not doing the kind of X height, weight, slant kind of explorations, and letting them kind of drive the parameters they want to affect based on the research that they've done. And then the next project from Jennifer as well. So that's like a process video that she made after 6 weeks of working. So it's really cool, again, to see how quickly these students can pick up this new tool and work with it. And kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, like it kind of shifts how I think about teaching this type of subject matter, because typically I would think about, you know, leaving the harder things for later in the term. But I realize now, after seeing how comfortable a lot of the students are with code as a medium, you know, we kind of bring the more difficult stuff up front, which then allows them to go a lot more in depth with their final projects at the end of the term.
Super cool, Roy. It's such an exciting class, and it's generated quite a buzz on campus already. And I find I'm on sabbatical this summer term, but I find because we're on Zoom, I find myself kind of sneaking into Roy's classes just to be a part of it, just to kind of absorb the intellectual information that he provides students. And also, you know, there's a particular method and approach that he adopts to teaching that breaks things down from step to step to step to step. It takes the idea of code-based operations and code-based graphic design and makes it much more accessible and much more achievable for a graphic design student that at first might be a little bit intimidated by working in this space. And as Roy mentioned earlier, you know, this is not about math at all. You know, it's about you know, it's about procedure. You know, it's about writing a series of instructions to achieve a specific kind of result. And also it's about designing systems and generative systems that might create unique, you know, outcomes. So really kind of excited about some of the foundation he's laid with this class and how well it kind of connects to some of the other classes that we have in our curriculum as well. So again, we really like to embrace, you know, cross-pedagogical synergies. And so thought it was really kind of cool to have Roy show you what's involved in designing a class and also show you a little bit of what goes on in a class like that. Next, we want to kind of give everyone a chance to see the journey that a student takes in transmedia typography. And we're going to do this in a purely visual way. So it's a process-driven journey across 14 weeks. And so it's kind of a loose coming together of all the different elements, all the different media that students are exploring. We ask students to work with, we focus primarily on cultural entities. We feel like there's a kind of richness in that research and that content. And at Art Center, we have so many great classes that really talk a little bit more about, you know, corporate brand strategy, things like that. So it's a nice complement to the range of classes we have in our graphic design program. When students start the sketching process, we want them to work primarily in black and white. You know, the thing about black and white is it really begins to talk about structure. When you add color too soon, you know, color is something that elicits a very emotional response in most people. So we really want to focus on structure, on identifying patterns within letter forms, you know, opportunity spaces that might evolve out of naming processes and form languages that very much are a part of, you know, a graphic designer's, you know, method and tools of working with typographic form. You know, the other thing that we emphasize as well is that the sketches themselves, although they're called sketches, we want them to be rendered with a degree of fidelity to the idea. And what that means is that the sketch should be rendered in a way that it doesn't encroach upon the concept it communicates. We want them to be highly kind of resolved when they're presented to the class. I should mention that, you know, we start, you know, again, black and white, 25 sketches in black and white. We look at multiple scales, large scale, small scale, just to make sure that the form language that's being developed is flexible enough to inhabit different media and different scaled environments. We move from black and white to color. And in doing so, we start to bring together the full formal name of an institution, finding opportunities for the graphic mark and the formal name to come together in different lockup configurations. And when students are working on these projects, you know, again, they're integrating tools like processing. You know, we want them to embed within the logotype design the idea of change, the idea that the logotype is not just static, it's responsive, it's dynamic. It has the ability to react to the changing conditions with which it's deployed in a real life context. You know, here we see the addition of color. We see a level of abstraction to something that's almost purely color. And so there's a broad range of approaches that a student adopts when it comes to the sketching process. This particular student chose to do something a lot more illustrative. Again, you can see in the sketches the potential for dynamism and for change. You know, we like to envision letter forms that are never still, that are always moving. And again, the idea of them being responsive and dynamic and requiring participation from the viewer to come alive, you know, that's something we like to embrace in the sketching process as much as the end results.
I think one thing to note here too is you know, with the combination of type 5 and generative typography, we're kind of in the generative typography class, we focus a lot on getting the students to get comfortable with the working process that allows them to move from processing, export stuff that they're working on and processing to tools like Illustrator or InDesign to allow them to further, you know, make adjustments and then ultimately work with outputting it as a print. And so we've actually created our own processing library that allows the students to do this in a really quick and easy way, just to kind of encourage this kind of back and forth making that we've been talking about over the last, you know, hour or so.
This is a sketch from processing. And again, you know, we like that the projects are really exploratory. You know, we feel like the classroom is a safe space for new ideas and for students to feel like they have support when they're taking risks within their work. And so we embrace a broad range of tools and a broad range of approaches. And again, the guaranteed end result is secondary to the process of discovery that students make along the way. Some examples that, again, require input from the user in order for the logotype to take shape and to really kind of come to life. We move from, you know, we spend about 5-6 weeks developing a form language for a cultural entity. And again, we're kind of pulling from the brand values of a given entity to give form to the typographic approach that a given student adopts. Then we like to take that graphic language and we like to explore it in print, screen, and then spatial media. So again, we try to sequence the class from the known, which is traditional media, to the unknown, which is something that graphic design students might be a little bit less comfortable working in. Here we see the evolution of a series of posters for a project. See the design of a modular typeface. And then the critique is everything. We understand that the critique, it's never about anything personal. You know, the critique is an opportunity to grow as both a designer and as a person. And so again, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we like to leverage the collective mind of the classroom. And it's very important for every student in the class to participate in critique, to be generous with each other, to support each other. And again, you know, when you're exploring new ideas, you're unsure if they're working or they're not, you know, if they're working or not. And so having that peer-to-peer support, that critical questioning, but also that support is incredibly valuable in the evolution of these projects within the classroom experience. Here you can see how some of the form languages develop at the very beginning of the semester in terms of pattern and shape and visual kind of rhythm begin to find their way into things like posters and websites and ultimately spatial media. We don't do a lot of self-editing. You know, we tell our students to just bring in what they've been working on so that we can have an inspired discussion, and that, you know, you never know when sometimes a sketch that you bring in that you were unsure about might lead to another really interesting idea. This particular frame begins to talk about how these form languages begin to inhabit a screen-based context. So you see the design of a website and also the design of apps. You know, sometimes a student might discover something working in screen-based media that then goes back and informs what they were doing in their posters. And that process of remediation is really quite valuable, that sometimes, you know, like the affordances and characteristics of one media type begins to exert an influence on the preconceived notions we have in working in a different media type. And, you know, again, as Roy mentioned earlier, we're a strong believer in the idea of learning through doing, learning through making. And it's really in the process of making that a designer can make all these discoveries within how they work as a designer, you know, how their process works as a designer. And also, you know, they can gain confidence in terms of exploring things that, you know, they might not have had permission to explore in other ways. And in some way in the classroom, you want to grant students permission to explore stuff. You know, you don't want to tell them that they can't do anything. You know, you want to provide support and kind of critical feedback so that they feel empowered in trying new things and really, you know, again, taking risks. Here we're moving into spatial media. And again, this class, this Type 5 class was something that ran in tandem with a media texture class. And in media texture, quite literally, is media and architecture coming together. And here's a prototype where a student is trying to decide whether or not her graphic language should inhabit an architectural context, something at architectural scale, or if her graphic language should be something that's much more, you know, kind of relates to the body in a different kind of way in terms of a tabletop interaction. It's fun. I mean, it's really fun to be in the classroom with these students, and it's really fun for them to see the different places and the different, you know, the different ways that they're each approaching their projects, and how they can begin to inspire each other. So I can't underscore enough the value of a shared environment that facilitates, you know, this type of work. And also what it does is it helps to create a kind of communal atmosphere, a kind of community, you know, and that community is quite powerful. This particular student's working with a pulse sensor. And so as the pulse quickens, the graphics quicken. As the pulse slows, the graphics slow. Here we're looking at the idea of environmental wayfinding, or even letter forms that exist at the scale of the body. And then again, you know, the weekend, we have a series of workshops throughout the course of the semester, these weekend workshops, where all the students and all the teachers that teach our advanced transmedia classes come together and work together, you know, as a team to help students create these projects. So here you see one of our instructors, his name is Ivan Cruz, and Ivan teaches media texture along with Miles Mazzy. What Ivan is showing students right now is how to work with an Arduino, how to program an Arduino, and also how to work with soldering irons. And you can imagine, you know, how both exciting and potentially intimidating this is to a graphic design student who's perhaps only ever worked in Adobe Creative Suite. What we find is that sometimes prepackaged programs begin to place constraints on the creative process, that the forms you create are more reflective of the programs than they are of creativity. So what we're really interested in is how the creation of new tools, unique and customizable tools, then lead to unique and customizable experiences and form languages. This shows, you know, how messy the space can get down there as everyone is kind of prototyping their media texture projects. The gentleman down there on his knees cutting foam core, his name is Miles Mazzy, and he also teaches media texture. And this just gives you a sense of how hands-on the weekend workshops can be. Our kids come by too. I should mention that the little guy on the right-hand side is my son, Joshua, and the little guy on the left-hand side there is Mateo, Miles's son. And you know, if kids are interested in what you're making and in the interaction of what you're making, that you've got something that might be kind of cool to kind of work with. You know, so then, you know, with the weekend workshops, you know, kind of empower and inspire and support these projects. And you continue to see them evolve. This is probably about, you know, maybe 11 or 12 weeks into the semester. So we're nearing the final presentations. This particular project here involves the idea of a graphic language that is impacted and affected by sound. I mentioned this project earlier. Again, the student is Chris Taylor, and this is how he's playing with and prototyping his program typography in a virtual reality space. It's a rebrand for the US Postal Service. And this particular student was working with the idea of drone delivery systems. And so he's prototyping that in our space as well, literally flying a drone through our classroom.
One other thing to note about these workshops too is they happen throughout the term usually every Sunday. And it's a time for the TAs that are part of the generative type and type 5 and media texture classes to host workshops for other students. So it's kind of, and maybe Brad, you want to talk a little bit more about this, but it's kind of about, you know, the idea of like passing the torch and helping students kind of build that community, but also teaching some of the TAs I learned when I was a TA for Brad, you know, how to teach. Maybe Brad, you want to talk a little bit about that?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I'm a firm believer in the educational process and in the shared experience in the classroom. And so our teaching assistants are incredibly valuable to the design process and the evolution of a student project. And again, it helps to facilitate this communal environment that is really inspirational for the students. As Roy mentioned, Roy was my TA, I don't know how many semesters in a row.
2 years.
And 2 years solid for the most part. And Taka is Roy's TA, as he mentioned. And what I see the TA-ships, I see them as an opportunity to foster young educators and give them a chance to kind of test drive test drive their abilities to inspire students and to be a part of the educational process. So it's very important to kind of work with potential teachers in that context. I'm going to speed things up here a little bit, you guys. There's something I want to talk about too. And again, if we're asking our students to respond and adapt to changing conditions in terms of graphic design, how do we as educators adapt to the changes that we've seen just in the past year? This is the last picture that I took of our classroom before we had to abandon it because of COVID-19. And so, it occurred to us that we needed to do something for the students. It was midway through the semester. We didn't have access to a physical space. So we got together, Roy, myself, Ivan Cruz, Chris Taylor, Danny Gray, and Chris and Danny were both my TAs. We wanted to create the classroom in a virtual space. So with the help of Ivan Cruz, we created a web VR experience that allowed students to present their work in the space, except the space wouldn't necessarily be physical, would be in a virtual context. And what we found that was interesting here in working with virtual reality is that we had a chance to not only display the work to many more people, but it's also a means of archiving the work itself, So oftentimes students create these really cool projects, really amazing projects that they've given so much to, and they're up for a final presentation, then they're taken down, and they're really they're quite ephemeral. And so the idea of bringing the work into a virtual space is also a way to give permanence to their projects and to create a robust kind of archive of the student projects. And so that was something that we found great value in. So we all worked together as a team and really just volunteered our time and our energy to create the classroom in a virtual reality space. And then also what's interesting too, which we'll see in just a minute, is that the virtual presentation of a project then leads to a dedicated website, which Roy designed, that shows the project in its totality. So this is a project by Christopher Gonzalez for the California Science Center.
This process was really good for students too. A lot of students up to this point didn't have a lot of experience writing about, they don't get as much practice writing about their work or thinking about how to curate and edit kind of a selection of things to present in this context, usually until they're graduating. So it was kind of a good experience for them to understand that workflow and that process, and kind of, we treated that writing process in the same way, the same iterative way that we do with design. So we were going back and forth, helping the students write and edit. And so this was also just a really nice opportunity for them to get this experience as well, in addition to celebrating the work at the end of, a pretty difficult term.
And in many ways, it felt like we were designing in zero gravity ourselves, right?
Yeah. Sure.
I was just reading Chris's tagline, or Chris's, micro identity. And so it's another quick walkthrough of the space and how it displays the work. And I think the students were genuinely excited about this. Again, within any kind of obstacle, there's always an opportunity, and it's up to you as a designer, as a creative person, to find those opportunities within those obstacles. And so I'm really proud of everyone that was a part of this effort. Next we're going to take a look at the work of a student. His name is Kyuta Sato, and this is a project from Roy's Gen Type class. Roy?
Yeah, so this is another kind of, so these are all final projects, but this kind of, again, underscores how we work across both classes. So here, Kyuta was working with a project for Caltech and was doing, a sub-brand for Caltech based on a research group there called CAS, which was the Center for Autonomous Systems and Technologies, I believe. And so this process video kind of shows Qta's process, working in InDesign and Photoshop to design the letter forms, and then starting to prototype the ideas in code, and then ultimately building out like the final software, which was a combination of all of these sort of code-based experiments he had been doing over the term. And again, like being able for a student to be able to work across multiple classes, single subject matter, really helps them be able to go in depth in the more, you know, tools and techniques driven classes like generative typography, where, you know, they're not focusing on the brand design aspect of the project and the code at the same time. They can really divide their time between working in a very applied way with code and then working on developing that identity system in the Type 5 class. So that seems to work really well as well.
So, and what we want to close with is a project for the school itself. So we worked on the Art Center View book, and we were really interested in kind of bridging the gap between experiments in the classroom and work that could be created in a professional setting. And so how can we design generative systems? You know, how can we work with algorithms to craft unique artifacts? And so we designed a system that would generate 40,000 unique covers, different cover for each view book that was sent out to prospective students. Okay, guys, that wraps up our presentation today. And I'd just like to leave you with one thought before we literally answer some questions, if you might have some questions. That design is not a noun or a verb, but it's a way of asking questions. It's a mode of inquiry. And it's a deep investigation into the future of visual communication. And with that thought, you know, I'd like to close down the presentation. If there's anything you want to add, Roy, you know, maybe add that.
I think that's good.
Okay, cool. All right, I think we made good time, you guys. I was worried there for a little while, but I think we're good.
You guys did perfect timing. I think you had the best timing of any panel. So you should be proud.
Cool.
There's a ton of questions, but I think part of this is for you to continue discussing with Roy. And, you know, I'm very intimately familiar with this program since I was around when you developed it. And I think perhaps part of your pedagogy and deeply rooted, and you should talk more about this, is you're teaching the students to tell a story. You know.
For sure. I mean, I mean, visual storytelling, it's at the very heart of what makes us human, you know? And, you know, it's a way for us to share experiences. It's a way for us to communicate across generations and geographic boundaries. And visual storytelling is something that in many ways cuts through the noise of cultural difference. And so, you know, that's just kind of zooming out and talking about the idea of visual storytelling. But, you know, how do you create a kind of a language, a graphic language, a typographic language that crosses over and coheres all these different media types? And one thing that it's important for us, especially in transmedia, is how do we bring, you know, kind of seamless graphic communication and story into media types that are just emerging, you know? I mean, a part of the great challenge of being a teacher is to inspire students to, you know, create new experiences and to be flexible thinkers and kind of reacting to the dynamics of a changing world that we live in. And in many ways, the way that we tell stories are changing too. I mean, so much of the way that we connect to each other is through social media platforms. And it has a level of immediacy and connectivity that we didn't have 10, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, who would have anticipated that? I think in the next, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, we'll start to continue to move into a post-screen environment where we're not going to be staring into these small screens anymore. You know, what is a post-screen world going to look like? And how can graphic designers be active in shaping that world and develop, you know, methodologies for best practices? You know, I'll say that what's important is best practices, but also what's very important is next practices. What are the next practices of design? You know, how do we prepare students for jobs that may not even exist yet? You know, and part of that comes down to process and method, the way that they approach their research and the way they translate their research into story. You know, that's incredibly important. And that process, that approach is something they carry with them to any project that they take on. So in many ways, the guaranteed end result, the final project, is secondary to the development of a method of approaching design.
I agree with you. I mean, not to change the subject, but a lot of people have been asking, and this is, I couldn't answer this. Some of the questions I could answer about, like, what kind of students are in the class, how long is the program? I think everyone's blown away when they know it's only 14 weeks, but I should preface that with, when they take transmedia, along with generative type and the media texture, that it's all they take. They're not taking any other classes that semester, and the students are upper term or graduate students. They really are. This is the pinnacle of the study of type at Art Center, you know, starting, and yet the same students who take this class might also take a letterpress class at the same time, just to maintain some sanity. That well, I know.
I mean, Roy and I were talking yesterday, and we were thinking, wouldn't it be just good to be like an electrician or a gardener, to do something very physical, to see just to kind of get your hands dirty, I guess.
But in this class, they do get their hands dirty. And I think that's, your presentation is so beautiful. We don't see the students getting their hands dirty. There's a lot that goes into in terms of tactile and sketching and making in both the generative type and in transmedia that comes before the technology building. People would like to know, the attendees would like to know, is how did you make the virtual space? And I know that was Ivan. If you can give them an idea of what it took to make that space.
It started, you know, I reached out to campus planning, and I reached out to Daniel in campus planning, and I asked if he had a blueprint of the South Campus space. And he said, you know what, I can do one better than that. We scanned the building 3 years ago, and we actually have a model that we can give you. And so I even took that model into a program called Cinema 4D, and he modified it. He cleaned it up a little bit. He streamlined it. I won't get into some of the technical stuff, but he modified it for us. And he worked in collaboration with Chris Taylor, who's very invested in working in programs called Unity, which is gaming engine, and other forms of software that really kind of are a little bit more not super lightweight, they're pretty heavy programs.
Yeah.
That enable students to work in kind of 3D motion graphics and things along those lines. But a lot of it was Ivan Cruz, you know, kind of, you know, really so generous and so much a part of the culture of Transmedia. You know, he really kind of jumped on board and was so helpful in creating that. And then Chris and I spent a lot of time going back and forth, choreographing the posters, getting them into, literally we're laying things out pretty late at night.
So the students sent you their work?
They sent us all their work in various forms. I think there were a few nights that Roy and I were up very late, you know, kind of cleaning up their files. We had nothing else to do. It was the pandemic. You know, we're all at home working. Yeah. And there was an energy there, you know, they were so excited about it. And so we you know, I believe that the collective energy of a classroom environment is just, it feeds your creative process. It feeds your soul. That's why we teach.
So another question, and I know I'll answer this because someone asked how many hours is the class? And I have to say it's officially just Transmedia or Type 5 is 5 hours. But let's just say, I know everyone's laughing, the students and the instructors never leave the building. Yeah. Sometimes they're there 24/7, and that's when I'll show up with food, only because I know I might be working and I know they're starving. So we all end up, you know, we're working late. I think that's the code of working ethic at Art Center. It's when you're committed to do something like this. One more question is can this be scaled down to a smaller program? I mean, we have the luxury at Art Center of having an incredible support system of other classes. But I know this is something that might not be answered here, but might be answered in the upcoming classroom. But is it possible to take this where you have a much more limited curriculum and scale it to fit in a different type of design program, a different type of education? What would you suggest?
Well, I think that, you know, the program, as Roy mentioned when he was talking about the design of generative type, you know, we see the classes as modular, as movable parts and pieces. And I think that when you look at pedagogy and not in a linear sense, but in a modular sense, then that gives you the flexibility to examine things in different ways, in non-traditional pedagogical ways. Can the suite of transmedia classes be scaled down? You know, they certainly could. You know, part of what I think is helpful in having the students really dedicate and commit to the projects is that it does cross over traditional media. So they feel, you know, when you're working with traditional media, you feel like you've got something real, you've got something tangible, you've got something that reflects your efforts that will exist in your portfolio. And so that kind of foundational aspect of the project is really quite important. Right. And then that gives them permission to explore things in a much more exploratory sense when they work with emerging tools and technologies. So I wouldn't want to get rid of any of the traditional media, you know, right. some of the foundational work they do in traditional media. I'd say, you know, that's a really interesting question. And, you know, in relation to the way that educational institutions are going to be forced to change, you know, I feel like, you know, pedagogy that is nimble, that is agile, that can be scalable from something small to something large, I feel like that's really quite important. Right now, all you really need to teach is a teacher, a student, and an internet connection. So is there something within that combination? Is that perhaps a future model for the idea of teaching design in some kind of way? You know, I don't know. I do place great value in kind of the physical process of making things. I will say that. And I do place great value in the collective and shared experience that can only exist in a classroom. But, you know, we're going to be forced to make changes. And so that question to me is one that resonates very deeply as we face these changes.
And perhaps in a smaller program, I don't think it's a question of you know, traditional or non-traditional pedagogy. I think in a smaller program, and someone asked, you know, our students don't really work 24/7 on this. I mean, this would be equivalent to perhaps a senior thesis project in another program where students are required to take their senior studio, and it's something for perhaps educators to suggest to them that one of their projects should be something that deals along the transmedia projects. And when you're in your final thesis or your senior thesis classes in a more traditional you know, we're an art and design, we're a conservatory school art center. So let's say you're at a university where this is a subcategory within another art and design, I might suggest, and it occurs in their senior thesis classes. I also was thinking, listening to this, because everyone is, you know, thinking, oh, this is great. How do I learn this? Even our own instructors at Art Center are like, you know, how do I learn more about this? You know, it's something to consider at the HMCT, presenting an intensive 2-week program on transmedia teaching for educators. But that would, I think, would be very difficult to do that online.
Yeah,
I think that has to happen when we get a vaccine and we can fully use the basement and the typography center.
For sure.
And it's you know, originally this was supposed to be at Art Center. And what's great about this is I love the fact that we're able to reach hundreds of educators and not just a handful, but it's something to give thought to that I think we would be up for. Can't be for free though.
No,
because I'm warning everyone, because this is a very valuable, I would say, an intensive program. And yes, you do this for LinkedIn, Brad. You have a video, I believe, on LinkedIn on transmedia design and transmedia typography. That's something people might want to look at too.
For sure, you guys. Yeah, if anyone wants to quickly Google transmedia typography or advanced typography, it's a course that we did for lynda.com several years ago, and they were eventually bought out by LinkedIn Learning. And it essentially takes you through our Type 5 transmedia class, and it touches upon media texture as well. And it's on the internet. You know, you can find it and you can watch it.
Yeah.
And to your point, Gloria, you know, it's interesting. I'll say that with our students, you know, it's a culmination of the classes that they take. I mean, it's a culmination of all the type classes they take. And when the work ethic is also very important too. So it's these foundational skills. It's kind of like students learning scales or kind of having chops when it comes to making graphic design, making typography. And it's also the idea that work ethic is much more important than talent. You know, talent's not something you can teach. I don't even know what it is. It's like this intangible thing. You can't teach it. I can't measure it. But when it comes to work ethic and the commitment and dedication to your project, that is something quantifiable. And so, you know, students are incredibly dedicated. But part of it is also learning how you work, learning your own creative process, learning your own creative rhythms, and really learning to manage your time in a good way. You know, I tell students there are 3 things to be mindful of when it comes to making graphic design, you know, in terms of your process. You know, always work in broad strokes at first. Don't get obsessed with small details. And that's especially important for designers that are interested in type, because we love details. That's our whole world. So work in broad strokes. Be sure to get feedback from peers that you trust. Getting external feedback will accelerate your project. And switch gears between your projects too. You know, if you're working on something continuously for 4 or 5 hours, by that 5th hour, you're working very slowly. Or you've convinced yourself your project is terrible. Or you've convinced yourself your project is brilliant. You can't see it objectively because you're so immersed within it. But if you work on your project for like an hour, you step away, you work on something else, and you go back to it, you see it with fresh eyes. You see it with a degree of objectivity, and that can accelerate your design process. And so that kind of, you know, that time management is really important when it comes to approaching these projects. Otherwise, it does take an exorbitant amount of time.
And I also think the way both of you work, and I think this is important for other educators to remember that not everyone is a linear learner. you know, a ladder learner, I should say, that they do one rung at a time, at a time, at a time. And this is something I notice in the classroom where, especially these very, very large projects, we know you have to achieve certain goals. And I love the fact that you showed, here's the week by week, what happens over the course of 14 weeks and what's required. And I think that gives structure to the class.
Yeah.
But as we know, some students take a little bit longer to reach. And I think as educators, everyone here has to understand and allow for students to, you know, some go ahead quickly, some fall behind a little bit, then they catch up. And what I always notice is, for some miracle, in the end, you know, they all end at the finish line at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's important, how they work within the class. And I think you're right, feedback from instructors. They have to have, you know, a little tolerance for the students who might be pulling a little bit with coding and with the technology. And the students themselves, I think you're quite right. You really, really have to give a lot of acknowledgement to your TAs.
For sure.
And to the other students in the class. I mean, teaching without teaching assistants, you couldn't do this.
It'd be impossible. It would be impossible.
You know.
And really the virtual space that we created last semester, Danny Gray worked on, there are different portals in the virtual space. You know, my TA, Danny Gray, worked on, you know, recreating books using Cinema 4D from the book design class. Chris Taylor, my TA, was also instrumental in working with that three-dimensional model. And so with your teaching assistants, you know, not only are you teaching future teachers, you know, but you're helping to create that culture, that communal atmosphere that's so important. And a teaching assistant can connect with students in a much deeper level than you can.
Right, because the students might be afraid of you.
Yeah, I mean, in the classroom, you try to turn the classroom inside out, you know, so that you're kind of in many ways moderating the discussions as opposed to leading the discussions.
Right.
And you create the conditions in the classroom for every student to feel like they have a voice, and that voice has value, and it's acknowledged.
Can we see the virtual space on the Transmedia website? Or no?
For sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's on there.
Yeah, okay. Just to make sure, we posted it in the chat room that we already gave. Yeah, we already.
You want to jump over to it, Roy, real fast on your end?
Oh no, I think shared this. I think
you
it's in
showed
the
it.
chat.
No, we already showed it. We already
Okay,
shared it in
okay.
the chat room.
Okay.
So you can see the virtual space. You can see all the projects, complete projects, not only in this Transmedia. There's the media texture, right? Texture class too. It's a wonderful website, and I think that's how you did your final presentation.
Yeah, we used the website as a means to do a final presentation, but I should also say that we weren't able to do it for all the classes. You know,
No.
It was kind of a labor of love, and
Right.
you know, Roy and I spent many late nights working together and gathering assets from students and reformatting files and stuff like that. I wish we could have done it for all the projects and for all the classes in our Transmedia curriculum, but it was just the ones that we were a part of because we were so intimate with those projects. We knew that we could work very closely with the students to have the material to post by the final presentation.
Right. It's, you know, we're coming to the close. This has been such an exciting event for me. I'm so happy. I'm going to almost cry.
Oh, it's Gloria. It's amazing.
Anything we can do to support.
Well, you
educators.
You're instrumental in the typographic program at Art Center, and you're so generous with your time. You're so generous with students, and we're just happy to be a part of your orbit.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Roy, and thank you, Brad. And you have about 15 minutes, those people who are joining the classroom, and I'm sure it's going to be packed, and we'll see everyone then. So at the conclusion of our first Design Educators Typography Intensive, look for our next intensive, which will probably happen in the winter. So, which will be January. So I thank everyone for coming and attending, and I'll see you in class in
Okay.
15 minutes. Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.
See you guys.
Yeah.